In this video, we're going to talk about a tool that makes working with Kubernetes for developers extremely easy, called Shippa. So first, we're going to see what problems Shippa solves when working with Kubernetes. We will then see how Shippa actually works. And finally, I will show you a demo where we will install Shippa and see it in action. Let's say in our project, we decided we will use Kubernetes to run our application. What usually happens in such cases is developers will start to learn Kubernetes, like Kubernetes YAML configuration files, Kubernetes components such as services, deployments, etc. And Kubernetes is not that easy to just learn on the side. So as a result, developers take most of the time away from actually programming and instead spend it on learning Kubernetes and trying to configure the application to run on Kubernetes. After the configuration, they obviously need to test that everything works fine. This means they need to deploy the application in a cluster. So they need to learn kubectl or set up a local Minikube cluster or learn how to deploy the YAML files from CI/CD pipeline. Again, more stuff to learn that has nothing to do with actual programming and is just an overhead of introducing a new technology. Now, what happens after developers have spent days of learning and trying out stuff? They finally deploy their application, but because they don't know Kubernetes so well, they may easily misconfigure stuff, where the application may be running, but long-term will create some problems. Or maybe they deploy their application with security issues, simply because they don't know the security best practices in Kubernetes. This could be related to external services, access permissions, storing credentials in Kubernetes, and so on. On the other side, we have Kubernetes administrators. These are platform admins who actually set up the Kubernetes clusters so developers can use them. So when developers start deploying their stuff in clusters using YAML files which are not properly configured or have security issues, admins need to take care of cleaning up the mess or identifying such problems and fixing them, and then showing developers how to configure it the next time. Or when developers get stuck, or they need additional things in the cluster like monitoring, logging, they will ask the platform administrators for support. So basically, as you see, developers having to learn and work with Kubernetes directly is not a good idea in most of the projects. It creates more effort for developers as well as platform administrators. The solution is to abstract away the complexity of Kubernetes from developers, to have something that developers can just feed their code to, and it will automatically create Kubernetes components like services, pods, config maps, but also do all of that with the configuration and security best practices of Kubernetes. And that's exactly what Shippa does. Now, how does Shippa do all of this? First, the Kubernetes administrators will connect Shippa to multiple Kubernetes clusters, which may be running on different platforms, after which they will create and configure what's called Shippa frameworks. Each framework can be configured with security rules, permissions, like who can deploy what in that framework, and some other configuration to automatically create Kubernetes components when the application gets deployed. So now, developers can simply push their code changes without worrying about any Kubernetes-related configurations. Then CI/CD pipeline will build the code and deliver it to one of the Shippa frameworks. And Shippa framework, which is already pre-configured by the admins with all the appropriate settings and rules, will check the permissions, do security scan, assign resources to the application, and automatically create all the needed Kubernetes components in the cluster. So overall, this means that instead of platform administrators needing to support developers who are struggling with Kubernetes, while also making sure the developers don't accidentally mess up the cluster, now the admins have all the control and overview of the clusters and how they want to configure it, while also freeing the developers from this struggle of working with Kubernetes directly. So both developers and administrators can now do their jobs more efficiently as a result. In the demo, we will see two main parts. First, we will see platform administrator tasks. So we will install Shippa, connect Kubernetes cluster to Shippa, and configure that cluster with different settings using a framework. Second, we will deploy an application into the pre-configured cluster as a developer. So let's start with the first step, which is creating LKE cluster. On my Linode account, I'm just gonna create a cluster, select the region nearest to you. Let's get the latest Kubernetes version, 2 of these nodes here, and create. So our cluster is running. So now we can connect to our cluster using this kubeconfig file. So I'm gonna download it. And once downloaded, we're gonna set the kubeconfig. And now we can access the cluster, which is empty for now. So now we're gonna install Shippa into our cluster. Using Shippa Helm charts, the first thing we're gonna do is create a namespace, a separate namespace where we're gonna deploy Shippa. So let's do that. And let's call it Shippa system. And now we can deploy chart into that namespace. For that, we have to first add a repository where the chart is. So this adds the Helm repository. And now from that repository, we can install the chart. This is the chart name. And as you know, when we install Helm charts, we can override some of the values in the chart, right? Using a values.yaml file. And we're gonna need to override just 2 values, which are gonna be username and password. So we're gonna need that values.yaml file first. So right here, I'm going to create values.yaml file. Right here you have actually the example of how to set this. And as you see, we have auth, and then we have admin user, admin password. And obviously we can set the values here ourselves. This is going to be an email address. I'm gonna put mine here. Password, super secret, and save. So we have the values file, which we can now use to install the chart. So going back to the documentation, I'm gonna copy this helm install command. And let's see that. So helm install, this is the name that we're giving to our chart installation. So we can call it Shippa, we can leave it at that. And this is the name of the Shippa chart from this repository. So in this install command, we're gonna pass that values YAML file as a parameter. So it will override this admin user and admin password values. Now we're gonna need 2 more options to set here in install command. So first one is going to be namespace, because we want to install the chart into the Shippa system namespace. So that's 1. And the second one is a timeout, which is important because the installation of Shippa actually takes quite some time. So we're gonna increase the timeout of this helm command. So it just waits longer for the installation to complete. So we're gonna set timeout here, and it usually takes around 15 to 20 minutes. So let's do 20 to be sure. And now we can execute this command and wait until Shippa gets installed. So Shippa chart installed successfully. You see some output here for kind of the next steps that you can take. First of all, we see that a default user was configured with the username and password that we provided using this values.yaml file. So that's what we're going to be using to log into Shippa. Now you can check in the Shippa system namespace, a lot of pods and services were created. And one of the applications is the Shippa UI. And we can access it using the dashboard web service. And since it's an internal service, we're gonna do port forwarding on that service to access it from localhost. Shippa system namespace, service, and the port. And now on this address, we can access the Shippa UI. And as you see, we have the login page, and this is where we use the email address and password for the default user that got created. And we're just gonna click next, fill out the form. You get the activation code for the email and activate. And this is Shippa dashboard, where you have a nice overview of all the Shippa components and clusters that Shippa manages. So now as a Kubernetes administrator, I can actually use the dashboard to manage the clusters, to create teams and users and to give them access to certain clusters, but also configure frameworks or set of rules for the clusters, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the way to give the Kubernetes administrators control over how the clusters are configured and what rules to apply when the developers deploy their applications in the cluster. So with the default user, you actually have admin privileges. So with this user, I could actually now create users and teams and give them permissions to deploy to the clusters, create frameworks. So in our case, let's say as an admin, I create a developer user and Shippa dev team. Then I'll have to add the user to the team and give them permissions to deploy applications into the cluster. Currently, we can't do that from the Shippa dashboard, so we will use a Shippa command line tool. And installing Shippa CLI is actually pretty simple. We just have to execute this one command. Successfully installed. So now if I do Shippa, I should see that Shippa is working. We have the version and the list of commands. So in order to be able to use the Shippa command, we have to connect Shippa client to the Shippa installation. So we're gonna add what's called Shippa target. And the target is going to be the address of the Shippa public load balancer. So right here, if I do kubectl get service, you see we have a list of services here, and one of them is a load balancer type, which means it is actually a publicly available endpoint. And in Linode, we can see it's a node balancer, this one right here. So that's basically the endpoint of Shippa. So I'm gonna copy that IP address, and right here we can execute Shippa target add, and the name of the target, we can call it Shippa. Again, the IP address that I just copied, and with -s, we're basically saying set this as a current target. So if I execute this, it says new target Shippa. Now that we have Shippa target set and Shippa CLIs pointing to that Shippa target, we're gonna log into Shippa, just like we did on the dashboard. So command for that is Shippa login. And this is the email address or the username in this case for Shippa, and then the same password. And now we can actually do anything in Shippa using this user because this user has all the privileges. So in order to see that, I can actually do user list, which is one of the commands. And this will show me all the users in that Shippa installation to which we're connected now. And this is the user I'm logged in with, which has basically all the permissions. And this is another user that has no permissions because we haven't assigned any. Now with Shippa client, we can create a developer role. We can add permissions to that developer role and then assign the role to the user and add the developer user to the Shippa dev team. And you can see all these commands in the Shippa documentation, which I will link in the description. As an admin, I will now create framework component for development cluster to configure which security settings and access rules will be applied when applications get deployed into that cluster. And note that framework will apply to a specific namespace and not the whole cluster. This way you can apply different rules to different namespaces in the same cluster. Now we have a framework, but we have to assign that framework to a cluster. And let's say our development cluster is running on EKS. So we'll have to connect that EKS cluster to Shippa so that we can apply Shippa framework on it. And this is a common use case because you use Shippa to manage multiple clusters from different platforms. I already have an EKS cluster running, so to connect that, we'll have to create a user in that Kubernetes cluster and then give Shippa credentials of that user to connect to the cluster. Again, I will link all the steps for that in the description. So now as an admin, we have created a developer user with permissions to deploy their applications to the cluster. We have added an EKS cluster to Shippa, and we have applied a framework to that EKS cluster, which means that now developers in this team can actually start deploying their applications to the development cluster. So how will developers actually do that? Also using Shippa command line interface. From their local machine, developer would set the Shippa target and log into Shippa with its user credentials. And using Shippa client, they can deploy applications in a Kubernetes development cluster managed by Shippa. So in Shippa, developers can actually deploy applications in 3 different ways. First of all, if developers are testing their code changes, they can deploy the source code to the Kubernetes cluster directly from their local machine using Shippa. Second, they can deploy a Docker image into the cluster also from their local machine. Or the third way, they can deploy from a CI/CD pipeline, which is going to be the most common use case generally when deploying applications. So in this case, developers would just push their code changes, trigger CI/CD pipeline, which then will build the application image and execute Shippa commands to deploy that image into the cluster. So in any of these 3 cases, the deployment does not require any Kubernetes specific knowledge or a bunch of Kubernetes YAML files. We basically just give Shippa the image or source code, and Shippa will then take care of creating all the necessary Kubernetes components for that application. And in our example now, we're gonna deploy an application from an image. And we're gonna use a public Nginx image from Docker Hub just to show you a simple demo. So basically deployment is gonna be in 2 steps. We're gonna create a Shippa application, which is gonna be listed here, and then we're gonna deploy that application. So Shippa app create, we're gonna give our application a name, just like here we have a dashboard as an application name. Let's call it my app. And then we're gonna have the team, because team has access and permission to deploy and create applications. And then we have the framework, and we're gonna use development framework. So basically we're saying create my app definition for team, Shippa dev team, using framework development. And Shippa knows how that framework is configured, to which cluster it applies, etc. So it will do all of that in background. So if I execute this, this will create my app. And now if we go back to the dashboard, you see that we have my app here, and the status is idle. And that means that the application definition just created, but no components were created yet. So now as a second step, we're gonna deploy the application. So the pods will actually start. And to deploy the application, we're gonna use Shippa app deploy command. And then we're gonna provide the name of the application that we created here. And we want to deploy it from Nginx image. And for that, we're gonna do -i for image and Nginx. So I'm gonna execute this, and Shippa will start pulling Nginx and deploying it into the Kubernetes cluster. And going back, you see that the status is now running and we have 1 unit. So if I go inside, we have an endpoint as well, which got generated just for this application. And if we click inside, there you go, we have welcome to Nginx page. So that's how you can deploy applications in Shippa. And for every application that you create and deploy, you have some metrics here for application, as well as the Shippa units, which kind of maps to Kubernetes pods. You can use the lifecycle tag to actually roll back the images. So if we deployed another version of our application image, then you would have the list right here, and then you can choose one of the previous images to roll back to. Now, just to note here, all that I demoed in this video is actually a free version of Shippa. So you can just install it and try it out for free. In the Pro version though, they actually have a couple of really cool additional features. So for example, for each application, you get network policies. So these are the network rules for incoming, so for ingress and for outgoing traffic. And you can configure this for every application in a very specific way. So from which services you allow traffic on which port, etc. You also have the security scans, which is a really useful security feature. So basically you get automatic scans for your applications, and then you see an overview of any vulnerabilities that the security scan detected in your applications. And you also have something called integrations. So with this, you can actually configure whenever something happens to your application, something happens in your setup, you can actually send automatic notifications to one of those services. And another cool thing that you have in the Pro version is an application map. So here you have a nice graph of how different components kind of interact with each other. And you also have the network map for incoming connections to your clusters and for outgoing connections. Now let me know in the comments what you think about Shippa. And with that, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.